So we finished learning about the differentiation allocation roles of classrooms with Talcott Parsons. And if you recall, Parsons made mention of how children are judged based on their ability to learn materials, their capacities, and their behavior or morality, the ability to perform the ideal student role, for example. Now we're going to learn about how curriculum and textbook adoption criteria takes place in Texas. Texas has a highly centralized state board of education, and among states, it's one of the top 3 states with the most number of students. Because of this, these two things combined, they have a great deal of influence on the rest of the nation regarding our essential knowledge and skills and the textbooks that ultimately wind up getting used across the country. Wong talks about the curriculum and textbook adoption process as well as the committee members who make decisions about the textbooks that get approved. She does interviews with committee members, and we learn about their values and priorities and how their work aligns with the functionalist perspective. Here's the adoption cycle for the curriculum content for Texas schools. I pulled this from their website. Texas curriculum for each subject is re-examined every 8 years. The reevaluation process occurs in an orderly, predictable, and transparent process. Then this enables people to buy into the process and in that way support the decision-making process, which then promotes the cohesion and stability for the society. It also means that change will be incremental, which also supports the stability of society, as rapid change can create conflict and disequilibrium. Wong points out that the educational content both shapes and is shaped by social interests and professional interests. This relates to Parsons' work about teaching kids about commitments and capacities, which again are specific skill sets like reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also about teaching kids about the economy and what they need to know to become workers and fulfill adult roles, and about the norms and values of the broader society. And those professional and social interests are really diverse. Political interests are rooted in what the state mandates that students learn, but they are also rooted in the expectations of what it means to be a responsible, productive member of society and a citizen, in addition to understanding how decisions are made. This connects to teaching democratic values and expectations as they relate to like the American way of democracy and civic participation is sanctioned. There are also ideological interests. These relate to the special interest groups that want their values and identities and histories and cultures taught in the schools, and how the things are taught in the school. We also have interests of capitalism, which is our economic modality that is centered in school, but which also shapes all of our other social institutions. Capitalist interests are promoted, and these are often in conflict with democratic values and principles. Because if you stop and you think about democratic values and principles, especially when it comes to elections, it's supposed to be like one person, one vote. And capitalist interests are about privileging the owning class interest and priorities and concerns. So stop and think about when a business owner hires workers, he wants or she wants the workers to work in the way that their job is defined, right? And so that's top down, versus when we're citizens and we're voting, whether it's for a political platform or for a public representative, no matter what our station is in life, worker, business owner, it should be one person, one vote, right? So you see the challenge between those two orientations. Now, additionally, the decision about what is taught is also a function of the cost of resources and the distribution the cost of the distribution of those resources for the state. But it's also a function of the cost of producing materials and the desire for publishing companies to make a profit off of creating these materials. So you're probably thinking, Dr. A, that sounds a lot like there's a lot of conflict and varied interests, which is like the opposite of what functionalism emphasizes. And while at the same time that might seem problematic, what I want you to focus on is how this process provides a space for the diverse interests to be taken into consideration and to be actually part of the process. And because they're part of the process in creating the final product, that's the right, the teaching material, because they get to play a role or have an opportunity to play a role and participate in that process, then they're more likely to actually support or at least not violently resist the end products or the end result, which are the instructional materials and the essential knowledge and skills that the state says school districts like must adopt in terms of the essential knowledge and skills, or the choice of instructional materials that they can choose to adopt. Now, this is actually the process that the State Board of Education has posted in just a little bit more detail. And so I'll cover these very quickly. And this is just so that you can know and are familiar. First, you have the call for new materials, and this is like the proclamation part in the earlier slide that I showed you. But that call for new materials and for information regarding the TEKS and the currently adopted materials. This gives people a chance to take a look at them and know what is in there. Then interested publishers have a year to develop material for submission. Then those publishers have to offer sample copies of those materials. The state panel members then review the materials to make sure that they comply with the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills and that they're free of errors. After that, the Commission of Education appoints textbook adoption committee members based on that application submission. Those committee members then get together for the summer, and it's a pretty intense short period of time where they've got the materials, they've got to review that stuff, and then they've got to discuss those materials. Those committee members review the materials and offer feedback. The commission submits a report to the State Board of Education and to the publishers. Then there's a public comments period where people from all over the country, anywhere, can come to the State Board of Education's hearing place, convening center, and they can speak for 3 minutes about any content area, and even children can actually participate in this process. And so at that time, the publishers can also respond to those comments, and then all of this culminates with the materials that survive that process being adopted. Now, this is a PDF of the form that gets used for the Career and Technical Education's Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills Committee. The form is similar to other content areas. You may notice that it actually says, right, January 10th, submit your stuff no later than January 10th, 2014. This is a PDF that I saved, and I didn't realize that I had saved an older one until I was putting together this PowerPoint, and I was like, okay, well, I'm just gonna let you know that it hasn't really changed that much. Notice at the bottom half of the right here, you can see that you can be an educator, a parent, a business or industry representative, an employer. And basically what that shows is that anybody in essence can submit their name to be a reviewer for the content areas. They just ask that non-educators discuss their areas of expertise and why they should be considered for the committee. And then basically what happens is you check the area that you want to focus in on here and rank order your selections, and then you can find out and potentially be accepted for the committee. Okay, so again, typically in the subject areas, what we have right here are, that you can have family, you can have teachers, principals, curriculum specialists. You can also have concerned community members. But once a committee is formed, when Wong was talking about the committee membership and asking them what their areas of interest were, they were particularly focused on the materials that were before them and making pragmatic and objective decisions about those content areas and about that content. And also you could see that they wanted to depoliticize any major concerns that people had. So kind of moving away from, oh, let's not talk about that stuff that's inherently political. And they were also that way about controversial subject matter. In fact, they tended to shy away from controversy or overtly political subjects. In this way, their concerns and values and what they centered when they were evaluating the materials actually promoted stability, continuity, like basically keeping things the same. And if there was change to be initiated, the change would probably be incremental, because that would be the type of change that would solicit the least amount of pushback from the public or from the varied interest groups. And so again, they were uninterested in drawing attention toward controversy. They wanted to move away from controversy. And so again, promoting stability, right? Not change. Now, Wong talks about how people tended to have two different approaches and understandings of what education should do. On the one hand, there were people who were traditionalists, and traditionalists were concerned about emphasizing social order, again, preparing people for those adult roles, teaching the cultural scripts and the behavioral expectations that are dominant and that leadership wants. They were concerned about promoting patriotism and the values and attitudes that supported economic and political institutions as they currently existed. So, for example, you might have discussions about Democrats and Republicans, but not the same kind of attention paid to things like or to parties like socialists, right, or the Working Families Party, or the Constitution Party. If those parties don't sound familiar to you, there's a reason for that, because they do exist in our society. But again, the traditionalists are really concerned with maintaining continuity. Whereas there's another camp of like progressives, and what we mean by progressives are people who are inclined to embrace new ideas. If you think about Goslin's work, where he talks about the discovery of knowledge, like there are people who are like affiliated with these textbook committees and with broader society that say, we've got to create conditions so that students have the skill set to grapple with new ideas, but also to be able to birth new ideas, right, from the existing ideas that are already there. They also want to encourage political participation and, are fine with social change and critical thinking. And these groups also, or this orientation also tends to want to talk about the struggles of social groups to get access to say like rights, so like women's rights, right, the civil rights struggle, those kinds of things aren't problematic for them. In fact, they think that those things are good to talk about, which would actually kind of challenge the traditional perspective, because again, if you're looking at patriotism and you're looking at social order and learning our origin story, our origin story is rooted in patriarchy, classism, and racism, right? So to talk about social struggles with minority populations is inherently having to actually critique people and organizations that are already in power. Okay. So the textbook committee actually talked about how they very much supported people participating in groups participating in public comments. They believed that people had the right to participate. It was an important part of the democratic institutions, public institutions. They felt that it was their responsibility to listen and take sincerely or listen sincerely to people's comments, but they also had some real concerns because they didn't see those people giving public comments as experts, and they saw them as people who had specific interests that they were trying to push. So that idea of like objectivity and neutrality gets called into question. And so they didn't really think of textbooks as cultural products. We're going to learn later that they are. But they treated them more as like an encyclopedia of um, facts, and didn't want to see themselves acting as political authorities, or the textbook acting as political authorities. And they saw these like people participating in public comments as potential actors with like political agendas. And so for them, it was like, look, that's not our space to be making those kinds of decisions and having those kind of calls. Actually, that kind of stuff is more appropriate at the local level, where leadership there and publicly elected officials there can make choices about what's best for their communities. So what they wound up doing is emphasizing, when they were making their evaluations, they wound up focusing on technicalities of those instructional materials and thinking about those materials as, one, are they compliant with the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills? Two, does the format and the structure appeal to the student? Again, because we want to get the students to engage with that material, but also to seeing those instructional materials as resources for teachers across the country, and at different skill sets, creating a kind of universal experience. But also, right, they assumed that the textbook would be only one resource for the teacher, and that really that they could have, and they could be drawing on multiple resources, not just these adopted materials. So overall, the process and the textbook selection committees, decision-making and priorities, right? Technical instrumental priorities wind up very much privileging what already exists. And interest groups often recognize and saw these textbooks as places where there could be struggles over the knowledge that gets presented in these finished products. And that struggle, and ultimately what winds up making it into the textbooks, into the instructional materials, will serve as a form of ideological control. But the textbook committee members were worried about being politicized and look like they were politicizing content areas, and they wanted to present a public facing self that enhanced the appearance of objectivity, and they tended to depoliticize and try to move away from politically controversial areas. And so ultimately, when you take these things together and focusing on those technical instrumental priorities and creating things that could be used by students and teachers, there was this kind of cultivation of supporting the adoption of materials that teachers could use to facilitate the teaching process. And in the end, right, that would actually create a kind of, not a kind of, but a more uniform experience in terms of how students were, one, engaging with the essential knowledge and skills, and two, how they were receiving the content, and then how they were processing the content. Because again, also paying attention to those prepackaged materials as resources. And so in that sense, it's one, a process that allows for diverse groups to voice their opinions and play a role in the creation of the final product. And then that final product then gets distributed and has the potential to be distributed to the school districts. Because if you adopt a textbook that's approved by the State Board of Education, the cost of those instructional materials is shared by the district and the state. And so it creates a more uniform, consistent experience, which again goes back to that idea of creating shared values and preparing the student for the dominant cultural values that exist. And so that's the other thing that winds up not getting really questioned or challenged in the textbook about adoption process. The thing that does not get challenged is who gets to decide ultimately which values should be prioritized. And really the continuity and that orientation toward incremental changes, like, well, what's already there is going to be centered and more likely to actually persist. And there has to be huge shifts in ways of thinking and understanding the world, and in a big consensus in order for new areas to be introduced and to be approved. Again, because the textbook adoption committee does not want to and doesn't feel comfortable with um, embracing that which is controversial, right? And in that sense, we look at that's quintessentially functionalist because it's promoting continuity and stability. Okay, so now after this, we're going to turn to Regal Crumb's work on individual students, their behaviors and values, but also how they engage with the educational institution. I'll stop right there.